It's the fall of 2005, and my family has just bought a brand new Dell computer. It boasts an astounding 512 megabytes of RAM and an incomprehensible 80 gigabytes of storage, which is 10 times as much as our old Windows compact computer could hold. Now, my brother and I had grown up with a lot of historical simulation games like Civilization 1 and 2, Age of Empires 2, and Caesar 2 and 3. Now, the first game that we buy for this super-powered computer is appropriately named Superpower 2, which promises us the ability to run any nation in the world and then realistically interact with the rest of the world and other countries, both in finances, politics, and the military. Unfortunately, while it was the very first game that we bought for our new computer, Superpower 2 stunk. Awash in disappointment, my brother saw a game on the discount display at GameStop, back when they were known for selling used video games instead of Funko Pops and being a meme stock. The game promised to do everything that Superpower promised us that it could, but instead dropping us into the Victorian era. In fact, my brother saw it several times and it remained on the shelf, forlorn. When it was lowered to a measly $2, we pulled the trigger. What awaited me is perhaps the greatest, most user-averse, frustrating, wonderful game I have ever played. Released in 2003, Paradox Entertainment's Victoria, An Empire Under the Sun, was Paradox's fourth developed game. It ran on their Europa engine, thus named for their first game, Europa Universalis. Like with other Paradox titles, you take the role of an omnipotent administrator who makes decisions for an entire nation from 1836 until 1920. The end date was expanded until 1936 with the Revolution's expansion. Your goal? To create the nation with the most prestige, greatest military, and strongest industries in the world. Of the three, however, prestige was vastly more important to your ranking on the world stage. Victoria, to put it kindly, was met with mediocre reviews. Critics praised its depth, but rightly criticized the lack of tutorial, bugs, and important information being buried under unintuitive menus. For me, who had dial-up internet until I was 18 and had no concept of patches, I cut my teeth and spent hundreds of hours on the original Victoria 1.0. For example, one of the bugs in Victoria is if you right-click on a country, an interactive menu will pop up. If you click Declare War, something you would probably want to do several dozen times over the course of a playthrough, the game will crash. If rebels who appear thousands of times over the course of a playthrough exist in a country you annex, the area becomes unconquerable. You know, fun stuff like that. Victoria sold poorly, even after its expansion Revolutions, which shored up many bugs and refined some of its gameplay elements. This would go on to make Paradox very hesitant to create a sequel. Eventually they did, however, and Victoria 2, which dropped the An Empire Under the Sun moniker, is considered one of their greatest games. But what about Victoria 1? What makes it such an incredible, addictive game? And why, 20 years after its release, it is unique among all Paradox games? Well, let's talk about it. I still remember my first game of Victoria 1. I chose the Papal States not wanting to go with a super big, powerful country. This was my first foray into Paradox games. I didn't know the mechanics, the strategies, or the memes that dominate the discourse today. I also didn't know that the game was supposed to be tough as nails. So I left the defaults on and jumped right in. Up pops a hint box with several suggestions on how to control the game and a lot of the basic concepts of it. I read each with gusto, excited to start a new journey. Within a year, I was bankrupt. I decided to restart. One of the major issues that I ran into at first was finding the information I needed. How do you find out how many craftsmen you have? How can you build a factory? What can I do to form an alliance? The first major hurdle for me was not necessarily the amount of information, but how to find out where that information is and how important is it. The next hurdle, though, was the amount of information because there is a lot. Further, pop-up events covered the screen, declaring relations had improved with other nations, inventions were taking place, and units had arrived in different locations. It was a perfect example of information overload. I tried again. I stuck with the Papal States, thinking the minor nations that surrounded them might be easily conquerable, leading to extra power, which I had no idea how to wield. This would lead to me religiously, no pun intended, choosing the Papal States as my go-to nation for several playthroughs. This time, I balanced the budget successfully. For a few weeks, and then I went into a deficit again. What? How? Why? Turned out it was the AI trading for supplies it thought I needed on the global market. A market that I didn't understand, ebbing and flowing without my input and without my comprehension. Again and again, the game was telling me that it was more complicated than I had already thought, yet I kept being drawn back. Yes, it was more complicated than I imagined and frustrating to boot, but paradoxically, that's what pushed me into the clutches of the game. It wasn't complex for complexity's sake, there was something here. A breathing world below the surface, waiting to be understood and mastered. As a nerdy high schooler, I had both the time and motivation to do exactly that. The name of the game of Victoria 1 is to gain prestige through inventions and successful wars. Additional prestige grants you secondary or great power status, which can give you additional diplomatic points, which we'll talk about later. As with other Paradox games, Victoria is a historical sandbox, with events that can be triggered and starting dates, but it is up to the player to decide how much he or she wants to color inside the lines. Unlike other Paradox games, Victoria is very economics forward. Hearts of Iron is fantastic, but you're not just building up resources and staying peaceful until 1948. Much like other grand strategy games, Victoria has its own provinces that produce its own resource. But then there are over half a dozen groups of people who have their own demands in their province, not just for materials and food, but also political wants and needs. Depending on their class, they'll need more or less of something else, or none of it at all. Paper for the educated is a must, but not for your average farmer or laborer. Spots of tea for some, tobacco for others, and always twirling towards freedom. And each resource, from concrete to steamers, is traded on a world market. That's a lot of information to compute, both for the game and for the player. Additionally, prices vacillate based on supply and demand. Resources won't reach colonies if you don't have enough clippers, and production of certain resources can explode if a new technology is discovered or an event is triggered thanks to said technology.
It's a rush to see your income jump when the efficiency of mining coal doubles in your country, allowing you to put just a little more into education and defense spending. One of the first major thrills I got from Victoria 1 was simple: finally balancing my budget and putting the Papal States into a form of homeostasis. The root cause of my budget repeatedly going out of whack was automated trading on the world market. I have learned since, and have always done so immediately when starting a new game, to always disable certain commodities being bought and sold. No, I do not need 300 stupendously expensive luxury clothes when my budget is peanuts and the average person in my country can barely afford food.
This event was the definition of a hook that sunk into me. I dove headfirst into unknown and untested waters, struggled, but then started to tread in place. Yes, the game was immense, but there was indeed something below the surface. Another aspect of Victoria 1 is the historyness of it all. Yeah, all Paradox Grand Strategy games are focused on a specific time period in history, but not all of them are so steeped in historical verbiage and explanations. Crusader Kings, Europa Universalis, Stellaris, all wonderful games that I have devoted probably over 1,000 hours of my life to. But how many of them have dozens of paragraphs devoted to philosophers and artists and inventions explaining their impact on the world? Ironically, in a world where the history we know might be taken for granted, Victoria 1 spends a lot of time world building. I had wanted to be a history teacher since I was 11 years old, and as a 16-year-old immersed in a geopolitical simulator with chapters upon chapters of reading in the game itself, I was simply blown away.
In the meantime, the classical music playing in the background has stuck with me to this day. I literally cannot hear a song that was included in the game in real life without immediately thinking of Victoria 1. In fact, I'm only playing songs from the game as my background music to this retrospective.
Now, at this point of the video, you might be saying, wow, that sounds like an extremely boring micromanagement simulator. And I can't say that I would blame you. There is no shame in preferring battle royales or JRPGs. I really enjoyed them too. But for me, at that point in my life, where I was in my life, Victoria 1 started to scratch an itch that had always been there, but I simply did not know how intense the sensation was.
After stabilizing your economy, one of the very most important things to do in Victoria is to turn a balanced budget into a profitable one. The best way to do that is by building factories or taking them through war. Also, economy-wise, never create a workday limit for your nation. It dramatically hurts your economy and gives people the false belief that they have a life outside of their job. You have to take a big risk building early factories, as your early machine tools are limited and literally no one on Earth has a factory that builds them. I learned quickly that industrial technologies give you more machine parts. Eventually, having the means to build a machines tool factory might be the most important mid-game strategy for mid-sized to large countries. You can lap the world in production by doing this. In the meantime, building factories that make you money and only need non-manufactured goods will skyrocket your power and money. The world hums along without your input, but you can also budget and then begin to control it with enough planning. One negative part of industry and exceptionally important railroads is that it can become very tedious to build. I'm not talking just about money and time in-game, but that you are the one building each development. That means clicking on each province, checking to see if you have enough clerks and craftsmen in a province, and what level of railroad is where. It's a lot of clicking tedium and takes a lot of time. Yes, it's invigorating to see the fruits of your labor after your planning pays off, but it can get annoying to go through layers of information time and time again just to do one specific thing. But now that you're a seasoned economist, it is time to expand.
Compared to Victoria 2, Victoria 1 is a vastly different experience when it comes to war. There are no bad boy points, there is no crisis system, there are no spheres of influence, no casus belli, and you can expand aggressively without having to stick to a single region or two in your peace treaty. Also, is it casus belli or casus belli? I honestly don't know. Anyway, the point is, war is a vastly different experience in Victoria, and it is hilariously broken. For example, one thing that's broken in Victoria 1 when it comes to war is if you are already at war with a civilized nation, you are not able to declare war against another civilized nation. You literally cannot declare war against someone new if you're already at war, unless they are uncivilized. Then you can declare war on whoever you want to, but once you declare war on a civilized nation, you can't declare war on anyone else.
Another example is that alliance systems can be utterly disregarded. What do I mean by this? Well, let's imagine you're invading poor little Parma. They're allied with Austria. The problem for them is, once Parma is forced to accept a peace treaty, the entire war is over. Austria will not continue to fight to liberate their brothers in arms, nor seek vengeance. This can be remarkably exploited to expand and have no consequences. Always invade the nation you declared war on and hold their provinces. Then, expand into other nations that were allied with the country you declared war on. If things go south, annex the tiny nation, no harm done. If things go north, you expand into their allies and then annex. It's like if after Serbia was invaded by Germany and Austria-Hungary in World War I, the Allied powers all had to create a ceasefire. Similarly, if you declare war on a powerful nation, if they offer you a peace treaty, there is no time limit on that offer. Literally, just don't click accept or decline, and you can hold it onto infinity. If they make a comeback, too bad. You offered a peace treaty 3 years ago, and I'm accepting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The backbone of war are the soldiers who fight in it. To create basic units, you need canned goods, small arms, and 10 manpower, the equivalent of 10,000 soldiers. There are other kinds of units, and they each have their advantages, but your basic division and artillery are by far the most important that you'll need to be victorious. There is no limit on how many armies you can build, nor a limit per region, which allows you to exponentially expand your military. Like other Paradox games, you receive bonuses during battles if you flank an enemy, if the enemy attacks a defensive position of yours, or if you have an environmental advantage. Frustratingly, if you attack an entrenched enemy on a mountain, it becomes literally impossible to defeat them if you don't have artillery units because your battle effectiveness dips below 0. You also have to account for organization, which can cause a superior army to crumble if you reinforce them at the wrong time or push them too far too quickly. At the beginning of my Victoria journey, I had seen 1,000 entrenched enemy soldiers on mountains and forests take out armies of 200,000 soldiers. To pry them out of their defenses, you need firepower. Artillery is extremely expensive, however, so these kinds of units are a mid to late game strategy. Instead, normal units are your bread and butter. Also, at the beginning, cavalry literally have zero firepower and cannot kill a single enemy. The same goes for irregulars. They are practically worthless at the beginning of the game unless you are looking to capture a province. But even then, they're not worth the drain on your budget. Another broken aspect of the military in this game is that if you have a unit in reserve, they take up no expenses and you can plop them anywhere in the world that you own. Have an enemy battalion that's broken through to your capital, plop down a few unused units, and bam, all of a sudden they're facing tens of thousands of soldiers out of thin air. This technique is also extremely effective with rebels who can spawn by the dozen over the course of a few days. There is also no supply chain to worry about, even if soldiers are completely surrounded.
So, how do you decide who to attack at first? Well, it's kind of obvious, and as usual, it should be the weaker, smaller nations around you, preferably ones without strong alliances. That said, if you are a more powerful nation near the beginning of the game, like Prussia or France, you might want to declare war and take a chance with a more powerful enemy if you think you can seize some of their industrial base. This will bring more profits and power to your fatherland, or motherland, or whatever you call your nation.
Like later Victorias, the world is divided into quote-unquote civilized and uncivilized nations. You can annex entire uncivilized nations at once, but the most provinces a civilized nation can have and still be annexed is a minuscule 3. Unless you start as a very powerful nation at the beginning of the game, uncivilized nations are for much later in your playthrough. So if we take the case of the Papal States, we would be attacking one of our fellow civilized Italian neighbors to grow larger. We would break our alliances with them, then declare war on them. To prevent being crushed by their remaining allies, we use the annexation exploit we talked about earlier to end the war if it goes wrong. Another frustrating aspect of Victoria is how few diplomatic points you receive. At maximum, while at war and a great power with high prestige, the highest you can get per year is 4 diplomatic points. A mere 4 actions you can take with another nation over the course of 365 days at best. That includes declaring war, offering alliances, offering peace treaties, improving relations, asking for military access, and annexing other nations. And none of that guarantees that these peace treaties or asks for military access will be accepted. You can completely waste a diplomatic point and get nothing out of it. If you want to expand and continue to do so quickly, often it's better to let another nation offer a peace treaty to you, as accepting their offer does not cost a point. Unfortunately, this normally results in annoying, though sometimes beautiful, border gore.
Recalling my days in 2005, I wasn't aware of any of this. I remember fighting nations with powerful alliances, failing absolutely miserably, and then reloading saves, trying it again, and then failing again. But much like my experience with the economy, I knew there was some sort of path forward. like snatching a peace treaty even when it isn't great, or when you declare war and your enemy doesn't have one of its more powerful allies join the war against you. In my case, Austria always cleaned my clock because they're allied with pretty much everyone on the Italian peninsula, and I hadn't learned how to exploit alliances and end wars early yet.
One of the greatest events in my young gaming experience was being able to build an army and take over the northern Italian peninsula after Austria was already involved in a war and did not come to the aid of their Italian compatriots. Another exploit, if you can call it that, are peace treaties. The AI will never, ever break a peace treaty because it costs an enormous 1,000 prestige. So if you are judicious and end a war by annexing a small country only at the very end, forcing peace for everyone, you get an automatic 5-year reprieve from direct conflict. They can still declare war on you if you attack an ally of theirs, though.
I still remember 19 years later, most of my life, France declaring an offensive war on me and the exhilaration of holding my own against another nation that had obliterated me in the past. I experienced a sense of accomplishment that I have almost never felt since. It reminds me of playing the original Final Fantasy VII later that exact same year, where I am still trying to chase that feeling of the first time running around the open world. And yes, I was aware how woefully behind I was when it came to new video games.
After the first hurdle, making sure you have enough money in your defense spending will keep your manpower high, along with creating leadership points to create generals and specialized units. Again, basic infantry and artillery are the most important, but good generals can make a huge difference. Now, let's talk about the pesky concept of free will and democracy.
We've talked a bit about some of the frustrations when it comes to Victoria 1, but easily the biggest for me is the tedium with dealing with subgroups of populations such as laborers, craftsmen, and clerks. Each has their own needs, which can lead to revolts. Each does a specific job and has certain benefits. For example, officers generate leadership, but need different resources than soldiers who generate manpower. These subgroups can be switched to one another, but they require certain resources, such as if you want to convert a farmer into a craftsman, you need to spend things such as paper or tobacco. In a game with thousands of provinces and thus tens of thousands of subgroups, this granularity gives the player immense power, but it can also lead to immense tedium. And if you want your factories to be running at full capacity, you have to go into those provinces and manually switch farmers or laborers into craftsmen or clerks. When you have built 100 factories, that is a massive time drain.
Another tedious part of the game is dealing with myriad revolts. As you expand, during the early and mid parts of the game, you will run into dozens or even hundreds of individual revolts. This is normally an uprising of a few thousand low firepower rebels. You must manually go around crushing these revolutionaries, and you better hope they do not spawn in a mountainous region, otherwise it might take literal years to defeat them if you don't have artillery.
So, how do you combat these revolts and make your subgroups happy? One way is by lowering taxes or lowering tariffs so that your population is able to get the items they need. A more effective way is giving your populace more rights, such as freedom of the press or the ability to have public meetings. And you don't need a legislature or a parliament to approve those changes, like in Victoria 2. You are the omnipotent leader, and what you say goes.
But still, low taxes and democracy will only go so far to quell the angry masses. Easily the most effective and indisputably the most expensive option is to create social welfare programs. Your pesky population has a fascination with staying alive for some reason, so heavily investing in unemployment, universal healthcare, and pensions lower their desire to revolt. And the effectiveness of these initiatives take time. It takes years for the revolutionary spirit to dwindle from your disgruntled denizens. Meanwhile, these programs are extremely expensive, to the point where full welfare is only achievable in a highly advanced and profitable nation late in the game. Except for work hour limits. Limiting them directly lowers your income a catastrophic amount.
While tedious, when it's all decently understood, it is an extremely satisfying balancing act. I won't say that I know all of the machinations of Victoria 1, but it's very satisfying to create your own push and pull on the economy, lower tariffs to help your citizens, and increase education to advance your research further.
An important part of Victoria 1 is also the ability to colonize parts of Africa. Unlike the historical aspects of the game that surround Europe, mentions of the horrors of the colonization and scramble for Africa are scant. Instead, colonization is a straightforward affair that requires time, money, and resources. Provinces and colonies are divided into regions. In order to gain a colony, you must do either one of two things. First, you can have an improvement in each and every province of that region. Second, and much easier if you can do it, is that you must have one of each of the 4 different improvements in separate provinces. Either one allows you to claim the entire colony. Improvements can also be taken from another country you are at war with. Either way, it's a lot of resource managing. You'll need to have many factories producing the mainstays, cement, steel, and lumber, in order to claim colonies quickly, or be ready to spend a lot of money on the world market to buy them.
These same 3 resources are integral to building railroads, which are the lifeblood of an industrial nation. Railroads are extremely expensive and tedious to build, but they can transform a struggling nation into an economic and industrial powerhouse.
Railroads simultaneously increase production of resources in a province, vastly increase troop movement, and increase the production of factories. Once again, this might sound terribly boring, but it is remarkably satisfying to have a nation of steel that is able to transport troops across a country in a matter of days instead of weeks, and across continents in a matter of weeks instead of months.
Speaking of railroads, here's probably a good time to talk about the UI of Victoria 1. It's not good. Basic information is fairly accessible from the menu on the left, but diving deeper into these menus or accessing what you need inside a province is pretty much a test of memory. There is no tutorial in this game, of course, but that might be forgivable if it was more obvious where to access a lot of this very important information. If you've ever played out of the park baseball, it's kind of like that. There are a lot of menus, but instead of staring at a world map for several hours, instead you're staring at an Excel spreadsheet. And a lot of the information you need to know, you need to find it, and then remember how you found it. Suffice it to say, the beating heart of Victoria is under a clunky mess of menus. Despite all of the criticism that I lay at the feet of Victoria 1, so long as you save often, Victoria 1 is an extremely fun and worthwhile game. Every couple of years, I find myself yearning for another campaign somewhere in the Victorian world. And often, I fondly reminisce about days in my father's den, playing on the family computer late into the night, building just one more railroad, or defeating just one more rival. I hope you've enjoyed this retrospective. It is the first I have ever written or recorded. If you enjoyed it, a like or a subscribe would be tremendously appreciated. Also, any constructive criticism is welcome. What could I have done better? What did I do well? And are there any games that you think I should do next? But most importantly, thank you so very much for watching.